Hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the online launch and sharing of the Burning Money report from the Committee for Sydney and Scyne Advisory. The name of the report is Burning Money, the Rising Costs of Heat Waves to Western Sydney. I'm just having a fight with my slides. Just not how it was supposed to go. Sorry. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, all worked in practice. Let's crack on. So just to firstly, let me acknowledge that we meet today on the land of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Camaragal people, and Cath, who's joining us from Scyne Advisory, is coming from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. And I extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are joining us today. I also want to thank very quickly the resilience program partners who make all of our work possible around the resilience work that we do, and also our innovation fund partners and global pathway partners who you can see on the screen. Before I get started, let me also introduce myself. I'm Sam Kernaghan, the Resilience Program Director at the Committee for Sydney. I lead our work on climate risk and decarbonisation. And I have with me today Cath Jones, who's a partner at Scyne Advisory, a national public sector and public purpose advisory group aimed at building more resilient, secure, equitable and prosperous communities. Cath is one of Scyne Advisory's primary subject matter experts in national resilience, helping clients respond to our changing climate and increased disaster risk, with more than 20 years experience in and out of government, working on crisis response and policy reform. So let's get into it. Globally, 2023, as we know, was estimated as one of the hottest years ever recorded. And February 2024 was the hottest February on record. We're also on track for March being the hottest March on record. With this backdrop, we know that Western Sydney is increasingly at risk from the impacts of heat waves due to its geography and rapid urbanisation rates. Western Sydney is typically 6 to 10 degrees hotter than the rest of Sydney, particularly during heatwave events, projected to absorb 2/3 of Sydney's total population growth over the next few decades, so increasing the urbanisation of risk. In 2019, in Parramatta, where we held the launch of the report on Monday, Parramatta sweltered through 47 days of temperature over 35 degrees. And that same summer, parts of Penrith reached 52 degrees. So new modelling reveals that heat waves in Western Sydney will double in frequency and duration over the next 50 years. The impact of increased heat wave days, when combined with growing population, will mean a steep increase in cooling costs for households, detrimental health costs due to heat stress, and productivity losses for key industries across Western Sydney. We know now that every time the mercury reaches 35 degrees, homes and businesses are burning money across Western Sydney. And we actually now know how much. These impacts are not being felt uniformly. Factors including topography, building construction, age and wealth of the occupants of each building, they all affect the risk from heat waves, as does the extent of underlying health conditions, businesses' financial reserves and preparedness, and exposure to outdoor work or activity. Understanding where, who, and how these impacts will play out is critical to informing policy, as is learning how to stop perpetuating these risks moving forward. Our report focuses on quantifying the risks, the rising economic costs of heat waves as a call to action for government, business, and the community. So now let me hand over to Cath Jones to take you through some of the analysis.
Hi everyone, I'm really pleased to be joining you online today. and really to be part of this important piece of work. I'm just going to skate through some of the numbers, and there is an open invitation if anyone online would like a bit more of a follow-up or a deep dive after this session. Please just reach out, and we're really happy to accommodate that. What we did for this report was really try to bring together our actuarial modelling capability, where we were looking at sort of the changing weather patterns that we can anticipate moving forward using, credible, reliable data sources, and those are up on screen, so I won't talk through it in detail, but overlaying that on with some of our experts who work in economic impact analysis to consider how might that heat projection overlay on, what our demographics are going to look like in the affected area over time, how might those demographics change over time, so whether by age or vulnerable sort of cohorts in particular, so the percentage of vulnerable populations in the exposed areas. And then worked through potential areas of cost impact. So as we worked through this, we did, I'm going to say, take a somewhat conservative approach to our modelling. We looked primarily at 3 different potential areas of impact. We looked at the impact on rising cooling costs, so energy consumption. We looked at the one that is often looked at, which is around health. So what are the impacts on health costs and health impacts? And then we also looked at productivity impacts. So really looking at exposed sectors. There are some sectors that are more exposed than others. Any kind of industry sector that has a really high focus on outdoor work, for example, or heavy manual work is going to be particularly vulnerable to business disruption on high heat days. So they were the 3 things we took a bit of a dive into. And I guess what I'd say, just as a broader framing for this, is we know that heat projections are not unique to Western Sydney. There are a number of growth corridors around the country that are going to be facing similar challenges, whether it's, sort of the growth of Melbourne, whether it's Adelaide, WA, we spoke about a little bit in our in-person session on Monday, and also our regional and remote areas. So this is really sort of applying, if you like, a concept across the footprint of Western Sydney in terms of the modelling. The other thing I would say is why I say conservative. There are a number of second order impacts that we haven't factored into this analysis. For example, the impact of closures of schools or childcare centres, which therefore have a second order impact on taking people out of the workplace to fulfil caring responsibilities or looking after elderly relatives or whatever else it might be. So for that reason, we're pretty comfortable with these numbers, that they provide a really good grounding and basis for evidence base for a conversation around how it informs planning and how it helps us moving forward in terms of bringing this data into our day-to-day decision making. So if we can just jump to the next slide. So what you can see here, this is really looking through the population exposed to health impacts. So we look at that as heat wave days. So it's the number of people multiplied by the number of days. So it's not that we expect the populations to be growing beyond 100 million in 2070, but that's 100 million heat wave days that we expect people to be exposed to. And vulnerable cohorts in particular, by which we defined for this analysis, was older Australians, as well as lower socioeconomic groups, perhaps with less capacity, to supplement with cooling costs or be able to sort of shelter in place, is looking at sort of a 25% of that overall group. If we can then move through to the next one. So then looking at those 3 dimensions of the potential impact there, we have the quantification. So you'll see the increased health costs up potentially 135%, productivity losses going up to 116%, and energy costs rising up above 2020 levels, up 44%, which then if we work through to the next slide. Yep. In gross terms, so that's really kind of then taking it to the actual kind of gross real costs in dollar value, so by way of increase on the status quo at the moment. So costs of heat waves quadrupling up to 1.4 billion today, and on average up to 6.8 billion by the 2070s. And I guess I'd just sort of say that obviously 27 years is some way out for those of us on the call. Some of us may or may not see through to that point in time, but certainly our kids will. And so, you know, this was really a planning horizon that we thought was fundamentally important from an intergenerational point of view. And really sort of anchoring that point that decisions we make now are going to be really important moving forward.
Thanks, Cath. And let me acknowledge just before I get into the recommendations of the report. Firstly, that there's a Q&A function that we've already got one question in. We'll come back to that. Let me just get through the questions, the recommendations. The other thing just to say is that with the recommendations of the report, we wanted to make sure that they built on the findings of the report, but also recognise that there is a Greater Sydney Heat Task Force process in play at the moment. So there's a wide range of experts across the built environment, academia, government, being led by WESROC and Resilient Sydney, who are developing a comprehensive heat smart city plan, which will come out later in the year. We didn't want to duplicate that work, but equally this report speaks specifically to the economic costs to business and households. So we wanted to make sure the recommendations flowed specifically from those findings. So let me just get into those. So one of the things we know is that no single agency has a whole of government remit to coordinate and lead heatwave adaptation across building codes, land use planning, critical infrastructure resilience, and business and utility continuity. The responsibility for solving heatwave risk does not sit solely with government. We know that, but responsibility needs to move beyond the current emergency response focus, which is led by New South Wales Health and Police. Those two roles are critical for that emergency response, but we're really focused on this adaptation, reducing this risk up front across those sectors that I talked about. The 2024 State Disaster Mitigation Plan that was released in the last week or so does identify the need for collaborative governance across government to build these trusted relationships with business and the community, and allocate responsibilities and other risks for reducing heatwave and other risks. So we believe a lead agency is actually critical to enable this collaboration to happen as a critical first step. Secondly, again, currently no plan exists for a coordinated approach to heatwave preparedness and adaptation, nor one that considers the growing economic impact on households, business and service providers. We know how much heatwaves are costing business today. We've done as Cath outlined, we've done a proportion of that work. We haven't done the comprehensive work. We haven't done the downstream impacts, the cascading impacts, but we've done a proportion of that work, and the numbers are pretty significant. So we need to understand the extent of these direct impacts above and beyond what we've already identified in this report, and then how they play out spatially. We've talked about how they play out across Western Sydney and the expected flow-on effects from extended heat waves we saw in Perth last month, the 7-day heat wave, thinking about the kind of impacts that would have. So integrating heatwave risk into new disaster adaptation plans, which are being led by the New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, as the current framework within the with which the New South Wales government's thinking about heatwave adaptation. So there's a third element here, and we've been speaking to New South Wales Treasury about this, about embedding the economic costs of heat waves in the next New South Wales intergenerational report, thinking about the timeframes of these impacts, but also now. So we know that risk, heat wave risk, is missing from that intergenerational reporting framework. and recognising that as those economic costs, $1.4 billion today and rising by 400% over the next 50 years, as those costs and those climate risks become more defined, there's really an opportunity to bring those growing costs from business and households into how Treasury does their reporting and analytical frameworks, and for that to then flow through government decision making, the case for investment in adaptation, sort of looking at those potential for avoided costs. The fourth recommendation, we had a really good conversation about this at the launch on Monday, was exploring the heatwave insurance options for business and households. So we know from this work and other work the growing financial impacts on heatwaves for households and businesses, and that's building the case for exploring insurance products as a way of transferring those risks in the case that they're significant for those businesses and households. So part of this is scouring international practices. We know that there are individual opportunities in places like Japan where heat wave policies are available for individuals to cover health risks from heat waves, and equally in places like India, small businesses are being offered heat insurance products to offset the lost retail income. So it's an emerging field, but it's something that needs a lot more work if, as we've projected, the costs from heat waves are going to become much more significant. How are we actually going to mitigate those costs? And finally, we can't kind of go through a discussion about increasing heatwave risk without thinking about decarbonisation. And Committee for Sydney in its 2022 work looked at a plan for decarbonising Sydney, and there's a whole range of detail in there, but just recognising that there's local risk that we're talking about here with heat waves, but there's also global risks that are changing through our carbon emissions. So we recognise there's a huge amount of global heating that's being built into the system, but we also need to, in parallel with then adapting to those changes, to also continue to mitigate as fast as possible the amount of carbon emissions that we're putting out from here in Sydney across New South Wales and Australia. So that's where we got to. I would love if anyone's got any questions to put into the chat. Love to hear your thoughts. The report is online. We had a really great discussion on Monday at the formal launch about some of these recommendations, how we take them forward. But yeah, I'd love any questions from online. Otherwise, Cath, are there anything that you want to add or reflect on from the discussion we had on Monday?
I'm happy to pick up the online question as well, the one that's come through. And I think it probably does speak to some of the conversation we had on Monday. So I think we took 4.5 rather than 8.5 because really it was important for us to, I guess, project a more moderate scenario. There are going to be people with different points of view, I think, on many aspects of the modelling and some of the assumptions and decisions we made in terms of some of the key parameters. We sort of took the pathway of going, I guess, conservative in terms of estimating the potential cost increase rather than going too far to the catastrophic end, because we really do want to make sure it helps support the ongoing conversation, provides a bit of a baseline for the analysis. So I think, there were a number of questions on Monday about, why we had or hadn't. So the one, we just spoke about earlier, which is not factoring in school closures or childcare closures. I think for us, again, it was, while possible to get some quantitative data on impact on numbers of days where schools might have been closed or childcare centres closed, it's difficult to model the adaptive capacity of households to deal with that on an individual basis, and there's a high degree of variation between different socioeconomic cohorts. So it was really to say, we've only chosen 3 parameters. Those are 3 probably of many things. I think one of the suggestions that came up on Monday was around the long-term health impacts if people can't get outside or need to exercise more moderately. For example, there are any number of potential interesting lines of inquiry we could have gone down, and Sam and I discussed a lot of them in the course of this report development. At the end of the day, we wanted to start the conversation somewhere. This is complex, and almost the complexity impedes kind of getting to the root of it. And I think the message we really wanted to get across is that this is not the unforeseen anymore. You know, there is some good data that allows us to know that things will change. Things are going to change over time. And so can we start getting some data out there that helps us start thinking about the cost benefit of prevention, early intervention, embedding, planning for our changing sort of climate and heat environment into sort of business as usual infrastructure decisions and planning decisions between all levels, between all parties who are part of that. I think one of the other sort of areas of conversation as well is just recognising that there's a whole lot of dependencies between, and I think, the recommendations Sam's just taken us through really speak to that, is that decisions we make today in one area may have downside consequences for other things we're trying to do to kind of improve our resilience. So I think one of the examples the other day was rail corridors and therefore reduction in tree canopy at a time when we probably want to be investing in increasing the tree canopy. So how do we make sure that kind of consideration of the potential costs and the potential downside of some of these decisions as well is considered in a kind of systems decision-making environment?
Yeah, and just adding on from that, I guess through the process, I mean, one of the things that we acknowledge through our process and through our work is that Sydney is home to some of the best global researchers on heat waves and extreme heat across the built environment, particularly from New South Wales, from University of Sydney, where they're looking particularly on heat and health, and the University of Western Sydney. And so we had some of those global experts kind of reviewing the work and making sure that we weren't, I guess, going off piste a little bit with some of those assumptions, I suppose. So best being really clear about that. I guess the other thing that we probably haven't touched on is that the modelling assumes no adaptation in terms of what the projections have made. So just being conscious of that, we kind of say this is the path that we're on, and there's an opportunity within that envelope, that economic envelope that we've talked about, to actually look at what are the costs and benefits of some of these adaptations that we've identified and which will go forward. Cath, there's a quick question there about monetising the impacts. Do you want to speak to that? I know that there was an economic quantification approach that went through, and that's all detailed in the report. Do you want to touch on that quickly? I'm just scrolling through other questions.
Yeah, I think there's a number of questions that speak to what we've spoken to. I think there was one on monetising impacts, primarily social impacts. I guess what we did look at, so as we said, we did focus on rising energy costs, productivity loss, and health impacts. We know that things like rising energy costs and health impacts and productivity impacts are going to disproportionately affect lower socioeconomic groups, for example. So that's where the data and the breakdown we did do looked at the split and the share, I guess, of some of those potential impacts across different groups. Now, we aggregated, I guess, the data up to the Western Sydney footprint that we've got in the report. We did kind of do some analysis, I guess, a level down, looking at relative impacts, because that looks quite different across different parts of Western Sydney. Western Sydney is a big and quite diverse area, as you all well know on the call from the various questions that you're asking, the kind of interests that you represent. So it was really, again, trying to get it up to a level that we have a kind of, we can start a sensible level of conversation. There's a lot more detail kind of going a level down that you could do to build off this analysis and really consider it. And I think that interplay then as well with the intergenerational report and how it kind of pulls through in terms of thinking about how those relative impacts might play out over time, disproportionately on various segments kind of or cohorts within a community will be really important kind of consideration moving forward.
Yeah, great. I'm just conscious of time and trying to jump through as many questions as we can. There's one here from Nikki about who the lead agencies should be. I mean, in the report, we very clearly state that should be the Reconstruction Authority. They've got new legislation sort of from 12, 14 months ago, which gives them coordination capacity around reducing disaster risk. And while, you know, there's both sort of slow wave and sort of shocks and stresses within the heat context. Certainly, in speaking with the Reconstruction Authority, they are comfortable to put their hand up to say this is our responsibility. How that plays out, we'll see how that works, I guess, because there's both the infrastructure piece, there's the sort of planning piece, there's the emergency piece. And sort of through the disaster adaptation plans, I guess the step one is the guidelines as to how heatwave is going to be integrated into things like the disaster adaptation plan for the Hawkesbury and Nepean, which is currently very flood focused. So that will be a really important test case for Western Sydney.
One point maybe to build that, Sam, because I think there's a lot of questions here about how do we get alignment between different people and different groups. I think part of the conversation on Monday was reflecting that you know, who pays now is not necessarily the same as who pays down the track. Yep. And really getting that individual sense in here in terms of the cost per capita. So actually kind of translating the costs in a way that's actually, it is going to be an impact on households and, you know, family groups, family units. And so while there might be investment up front, you know, we need to kind of think about who's going to pay the long term and then how do you therefore influence decisions. And I think part of the conversation the other day as well was making sure while New South Wales is working on regional adaptation plans, you know, there are other levels of investment. You know, there's local government decision making, there's federal funding and federal investment that comes through, and actually we really need to get kind of this decision making and these inputs and considerations embedded in all the levels that are going to particularly drive that sort of future urban planning, you know, infrastructure planning, and making sure we get that kind of regulatory alignment and incentives alignment through all of those levels if we're actually going to see the change we need to see.
Yeah, and sort of building on that, I mean, just being really conscious that the work to date in New South Wales has been led by local government, really. And the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force is a collaboration of, you know, WesRock and Resilient Sydney as a coordination of local government functions, inviting in state government actors to come and be part of that collaboration. Not to say state government is not doing anything. There's some great work being done around increasing tree canopy and looking at adapting to changing hazard risk around heat. But it's actually how do we get beyond, as we said, get beyond that kind of emergency response element, which has really been the focus to date at that sort of state government heatwave leadership, and actually think about how we connect, as you say, Cath, from that sort of local government, local understanding through state government and their sort of new legislative requirements and emergency response requirements through to that federal role and connecting the funding through as well. Very conscious of time. We've got to drop off very shortly. I'm going to see how many of these we can answer. Type an answer in where they're where possible. For those who haven't seen the report, you can access it online at sydney.org.au. It's on the front page of the Committee for Sydney's website, and I recommend, you know, you spend a bit of time having a look at it. There is also a huge amount of work coming through the pipeline from the Greater Sydney Heat Task Force, which will provide that kind of comprehensive heat smart city plan. And for those who we have like Western Sydney Airport on the call, for those who are not involved in that and can see a role for themselves, I'm sure that I'm happy to connect you to the leaders of that work to ensure that your perspective and knowledge and future infrastructure plans are being integrated into that. Let's leave it there. Been great to have those questions. Thank you very much. We'll have a go at answer any of those, but please follow up with either myself or Cath. I'm at the Committee for Sydney, just sam@sydney.org.au for any further questions, and I can connect you with Cath and as I said, to the Heat Task Force work. But it's been a phenomenal piece of work. Thank you again to Scyne and to Cath for their commitment to this work, and thank you everyone for joining us for this short little bite on a Friday lunchtime to talk about the economics, the rising cost of heat waves in Western Sydney. Thank you.